Hi, I'm Bridget Murtaugh, a program manager on the .NET team here at Microsoft. Welcome back to .NET for Apache Spark 101, where we dive into the exciting world of big data analytics in the .NET ecosystem. So in the last video in this series, I left it on a bit of a cliffhanger. We saw that we were trying to use ML.NET in combination with .NET for Apache Spark, and we were using a method called sentiment, which I hadn't yet created. So let's see what that sentiment method is going to entail and how we can actually introduce our ML.NET code in our big data project. So now I've created the sentiment method that we were waiting to create in the last video. And within it, I'm putting in the code that was generated from Model Builder, which we had run in our previous video as well. Within this code, we're loading the model that Model Builder had created. We're creating some sort of input to test with our trained model. And then we actually try running our model on the sample input data. So let's see how it actually works. So we can see that it takes in a model input and produces a model output. In our case, the model input is going to be some sort of review text, so I'll call that review. And our model output is going to be the prediction with that review. So is it a positive or negative review? So I'll call that review prediction. So our input is going to be each review in the data frame that we've created earlier. But I'm going to do that differently below. So I'll go ahead and comment out this line for now where it asks for a variable input. So with this final line, it's when we actually perform the prediction. So we actually use our trained machine learning model for sentiment analysis to perform the sentiment analysis. So we'll call our answer result, and we're going to use something called the prediction engine to actually conduct this prediction. So we can see above that when we said review and review prediction were two of our data types, it has a red underline, which means that they don't exist yet. So let's create that now. I'm going to create a new public class review that will represent our input data, which is a set of online reviews. And the only column that we need to worry about in our input data is just a string that represents the actual text of the review. And I'm going to call it column 1 since our input data, which has headers, does call it column 1. So now that we've created our public class review, we also want to create public class review prediction to represent the predicted review values that we're going to get once we perform sentiment analysis. So in our case, there's a couple of things that we want to include in this class. So the first column that I'm going to introduce into our review prediction is going to deal with what the predicted label is of our data. So in this case, this is really important for our application since it deals with what is the prediction for a given review. Is it going to be positive or is it going to be negative? And then once we have the predicted label or the prediction, we also have a couple of values associated with how likely it is that that's correct. So we have a probability and we also have a score. So now that we've set up our review and our review prediction classes, we can go back to our sentiment method and fill it in to complete it. So within the predict method, I'm going to create a new review object. And within that object, I want to make sure I set column 1, which is what the text of the review is. And I'll set it to the value review, which represents the input string that's going to be coming from our input file. And finally, we want to return whether it's true or false, positive or negative sentiment, so I'm going to return result.prediction. So now in order to actually use ML.NET with .NET for Apache Spark, I need to call that UDF that I had created. So I'm going to create a replace temp view, which means that I'm creating a new view of my data that will live and die with my Spark session. And then I'm also going to create a new data frame. And within this data frame, I can actually make a SQL call to my data to filter it and to process it in some way. So I'm going to call spark.sql and then use typical SQL syntax to analyze my data further. So I'll select column 1, which represents each review. And then I'm going to also select MLUDF column 1, which means I'm passing each input review to the UDF I had created. So I'm going to pass each review to the ML.NET code and perform sentiment analysis on it. Finally, I'll call the show method so that I can see the output of my sentiment analysis. So if you've seen a couple other of the .NET for Apache Spark 101 videos, you might have noticed that when we have very long strings of data frames, it can sometimes be cut off or kind of hard to read. So in order to address that, because we know that some of our reviews might be kind of long, we're going to do something to print out our data in an alternative way. So I'm going to use an IEnumerable and call the collect method on my data frame. Now what collect does is it essentially just rounds up or collects the rows of my data frame into an enumerable. So it creates a list of my rows. So instead of using a data frame object, I can work with them as a list. So for every row in my set of rows, what I'm going to do is just print it out to the screen. But since I might have a lot of rows, since I might have a lot of input data, I'm going to limit it to just the first 20 rows. And now finally, since I've output my data in a few different ways, I'm going to call spark.stop to finish the execution of my program. Okay, so now that we've written our whole program and we want to see the output of our ML.NET and .NET for Apache Spark code, let's go ahead and move into the directory of our Spark into ML app and go ahead and build it as well. And now we can actually run our program using the spark-submit command, just like we always run our Spark programs. So as that processes, we're first expecting to see just our input file, since we read it into a data frame and then called .show. And that's exactly what we see here, just our raw input data and a 0 or 1 to represent the sentiment. Now we continue processing, and now we can see that this is our input data again, the reviews, but with the prediction from our ML.NET model. And finally, we can see that we concluded with our IEnumerable, so our data didn't get cut off, so we can see the full reviews and still followed by true or false, representing positive or negative sentiment. Thanks for joining me in this video, where we finished up our ML.NET and .NET for Apache Spark application and actually ran sentiment analysis using ML and big data. Be sure to check out the other videos in the .NET for Apache Spark 101 series so that you can learn even more interesting functionality using big data analytics in the .NET ecosystem.